To cut a rather long story short enough to read, a few years ago I ended up in an obscure but safe anchorage called Hecla Haven. Not many people go there because it's 100 miles up Scoresby Sound, a monster fjord in northeast Greenland. Until the climate in the north took a turn for the better, the whole inlet was largely unapproachable because the pack ice rarely cleared out. The great Bill Tillman took a pass at it without success in his Bristol Channel pilot cutter. So did many others, following in the wake of the Danish expedition ship Hecla, which somehow made it all the way and spent the winter of 1891 iced in. Her crew called the harbour after their ship, which was a pensioned-off Norwegian sealer lately engaged in collecting muskox for European zoos. The Danes might not have been imaginative when it came to naming places, but they knew a good lee when they found one. Scoresby Sound, which is now more or less accessible in late summer, is a place where the wonders of the Lord are spread out for any mariner who has made the effort to get there. Savage black basalt cliffs rise vertically to 2,000 feet, topped by jagged peaks, poking impossibly through the ice cap that sits silently over everything like thick icing on a Christmas cake. Down in the wide sound, huge bergs, nasty-minded growlers the size of white vans, and all manner of sculptured ice drift around in splendour, while every valley carries a glacier, carving into often limpid waters. It is literally awesome. Unfortunately, the sides are so steep too that there isn't much in the way of harbours. Always excepting Hecla Haven. My shipmates and I arrived fresh from the madness of the Denmark Strait around midnight. We were in my pal Ian's Fisher 37, rescued from ignominy and rebuilt to full high-latitude standard by Ian himself. The barometer stood rock steady, but a near gale-force falling wind was whipping off the mountains as we worked our way through a frozen obstacle course. Inside the haven, we found 20 feet of water and a likely bottom, so we let go of the biggest CQR, dug it in, and awarded ourselves a man-sized top from the Pusser's decanter. The thing about Scoresby Sound is that, apart from an Inuit settlement opposite Cape Brewster at the entrance, there's nobody else, bar a few prospectors, between you and the North Pole. Down south, little disturbs nature before Angmagsalik, several hundred miles away. So, depending on your point of view, you have the pleasure, or otherwise, of being on your own. It came as a shock, therefore, when a scruffy plastic speedboat that would have been comfortably at home on a Sunday afternoon in Poole Harbour zoomed out from behind a grounded berg in the roaring twilight and beetled across to us. Its modest outboard was throttled back as it bumped alongside, and we noted 3 occupants, all unmistakably indigenous. An elderly gent huddled in the aft seat, swaddled in furs. At the wheel stood a strapping young man wearing a modern puffer jacket. By his side, closest to our guardrail and hanging on to it casually, was a youngish woman who'd have done well posing for a fashion catalogue as what the well-dressed Inuit hunter is wearing. She was so well padded that she appeared formless, but her broad face was framed by an old-fashioned fur-trimmed hood. She'd have been at home peeping out of an antique igloo, but appearances can be deceptive around midnight at 70 North. "Good evening," she began, in clear English. "Do you have a weather forecast by any chance?" I almost dropped my tumbler of rum. We were unwilling to disappoint a lady, but we belonged to the dinosaur school of yachting with no radio beyond VHF and an old Navtex that wasn't working too well in here. Our on-board bulletin consisted of inspecting the sky and reading the glass. "Unfortunately, no," we replied, astounded that these people who hunt on the ice all winter long could possibly be asking a bunch of greenhorns about the most basic of elements. "Well then," she continued conversationally, just as if she'd been asking a neighbour what he thought of the chances of a channel crossing in the marina at Lymington, "do you think this wind is set in, or will it drop off soon?" I looked at Ian. He looked at my son-in-law, Dan. They both looked at me. None of us had spent a night to leeward of a 2-mile thick ice cap before, but it was getting colder, so I took the initiative. "What do you think?" I asked. "We have no instruments," she replied. I'd have thought that went without saying, but I rose to the challenge. "We have a barometer," I announced proudly, now a point ahead of the game. "It's steady, so we're hoping this will ease off in an hour or two." "Thank you. Good night." This most improbable of meetings was now brought to a close as the speedboat clunked into gear and shot away out of the anchorage. The last we saw of it, as the light behind the northern mountains brightened with the suggestion of dawn, it was disappearing seawards, jinking through the growlers like a centre three-quarter with the try-line in his sights. An hour later, we turned in, having shown the rum bottle a thing or two. Outside the wheelhouse, all was still, and an eroded berg was drifting in to close off the narrow entrance to our haven. It was time for the bunk. A few days later, we crept out of our hole between the berg and a cairn that probably dated from the original Hecla. The chaps can't have had much else to do in those long winter nights, although they did survey the local land with remarkable accuracy. What they couldn't manage, because of the wall-to-wall pack ice, was to produce much in the way of depth soundings. The modern pilot book, excellent though it is, cannot hope to offer perfect detail of such a vast and largely unexplored area. It did, however, mention a rock awash somewhere around the start of a fjord whose mouth lies on the north side of the island. A jaunt ashore, brought short by bear tracks in the snow, had suggested that the water was now navigable, at least as far as the ice went, so we decided on a modest survey of our own. At slow speed, we slipped through a group of grounded bergs to the mile-wide sound between the north shore of Denmark Island and the mainland. The rock was probably in this vicinity somewhere, but it wasn't marked on the best available chart. The water was littered with bergy bits and growlers as we crawled onwards. Then Dan spotted a lump that seemed to feature a growth of green algae. The icy chunks were moving around a little in the lightest of swells, but this was, as you might say, rock solid. We'd found it. Now we had to pinpoint its position. By comparing the chart with our GPS fixes, we'd already deduced that GPS was operating hereabouts with a horizontal datum shift of a whole nautical mile. This meant we couldn't trundle up to the rock to read off its location. It could only be defined by relating it to the surrounding land. This, of course, is what the sensible mariner really wants to know. A row of figures to 3 decimal places isn't very helpful in an area where GPS is useless for anything except telling you the time of sunrise. The chart, however, wasn't bad, so we navigated round the rock, taking bearings on it each time it lined up with an unmistakable land feature. The 3 transits that resulted crossed without so much as the sniff of a cocked hat. We had it, bang to rights. So, if you happen to be interested in the rock around the back of Denmark Island, you can get in touch with me. Or maybe you can ask the Inuit, if you can find them. Even if you can't, the whole business might serve as a reminder that the old ways still work when the wonders of science have run off the page.